7. It's the oldest possession I have, and the only one, in fact, that links me to my childhood. I walked into Lunghwa camp, my Japanese camp, with this set in the winter of 42, 43, and I walked out with it in the summer of 1945, and I've had it ever since. My father and I played chess with this set, and my son and I, years later, used to play chess with it. It's a very special, I mean, it's my only link with my past. No, I think what made me realize that things had changed was the way the adults in Lunghwa camp responded to internment. Up till the war, adults had been magisterial, supremely confident creatures. My mother beautifully dressed, my father a sort of a distant figure stepping into the back of a chauffeur-driven car, and all the adults were they were sort of gilded figures who might have been in a movie. Then in the camp, I watched, as a boy of 11, 12, with the beginnings of an adult mind, the way in which pressures were beginning to erode and weaken their personalities. And that was the real education. I think I realized for the first time, which I would not have done otherwise, that adult human beings were fallible, that they could give in to despair, they could give in to petty squabbles, they could give in to weakness. And some could triumph over it, despite their own weaknesses, because there were many brave people in the camp who triumphed over being rather modest and being, in many ways, rather weak individuals. But they were able to triumph over their weaknesses and survive. That was a great lesson.
What about you, though, the growing boy? How were you able to grow up with any set of relevant values? You yourself, as you tell it in The Empire of the Sun, became a bit of a dealer, you nicked food, you survived. Why haven't you been spoiled by that? I mean, why aren't you a criminal person now?
Well, I probably was spoiled by it, but of course life, as I've often thought, life in Lunghwa camp and life in Shanghai and the Far East in the 1930s and 1940s as a whole was much closer. It wasn't some sort of strange anomaly. It was much closer to the way, the majority of human beings on this planet have always lived, and much closer to the way the majority of human beings still live today. We in Western Europe, and in the more prosperous sort of suburbs of our English cities, we are living in very artificial enclaves.
But you played chess with your father in the camp. You like games. Did you have rules for getting through from day to day as a boy?
No, I thoroughly enjoyed my nearly 3 years in Lunghwa camp.
In the camp?
Yes, it was a huge slum. And the people who really relish life in a slum, of course, are the teenage boys. They run wild. I ran wild. I was totally out of control of my parents. And that's why I left them out of Empire of the Sun when I came to write the book, because it wasn't psychologically true to have had my parents in the novel. To all intents and purposes, in Lunghwa camp between the ages of 12 and 15, I was a hooligan. I mean, I was, a street urchin. As you say, I was sort of out for any deal. How could I get hold of this 2-year-old copy of Popular Mechanics magazine from these American sailors? Offer them some little service. Snatch another extra sweet potato. Now, but that's life, that's life on the streets of Cairo, Bombay.
How did it equip you to deal with life, then?
Well, I think it's taught me to see the truth of everything, to be unsentimental, and at the same time to guard and value my own sort of imagination and my own pride, and what I've decided for myself are the best things in life. I mean, in later life for my children and the people I care for. I think it's also given me a freewheeling imagination, of course, that I've put to use as a writer.
Let's talk about this. What is it?
This is a replica of a funeral horse that in classical Japan used to be buried with the dead. And I've had it for about 20 years. It's made of terracota. It was given to me by my Japanese publisher, who came to visit me. A very strange present. I couldn't help but think there was an ulterior motive.
Were it put in a coffin?
Yes, and I've grown to like it. And I think when I die, I shall ask for it, I shall leave instructions that it should be, buried with me in my coffin, because it's a sort of constant friend.
The Japanese who put you in prison and who shot and killed a lot of people around where you were in Shanghai in the war, you admired them. As a young boy, you admired even your captors. Now, what was that like?
I did admire the Japanese. I think there's no doubt about that. I have to be honest. And I still do, even though they were extremely brutal and cruel. And any sort of British serviceman hearing me say this will think I'm absolutely mad.
Are you? I mean, why do you like them?
I think as a boy, I admired in my naive way, I admired their tremendous courage. I mean, I'd seen the Japanese forces fighting around Shanghai in 1937 when they first invaded China. I'd seen them enormously outnumbered by the Chinese armies, fighting on from sort of waterlogged riverbanks and sort of ready to fight to the end. I enormously admired their courage. This is as a child. I'm speaking as the child I was. I mean, now that I'm older, I don't value sort of physical courage in quite the same way. I think the readiness to sort of fight on to the end and kill your prisoners as well isn't something I admire at all now. I think I also admired a sort of melancholy strain in the Japanese. I think in a curious way the Japanese enjoy being sad. It's a strain in their makeup. I think it's something that I was never sad as a child, and I haven't often been sad as an adult, but there's something about that sort of sad, that wished-for sadness, which is very close to a sort of philosophical attitude to life. If you adopt...
Fatalistic?
It's fatalistic.
And do you share that?
To some extent, I do. I think it's curious that the Chinese also share something there. I mean, people have said, and I thought this as a child, that the Chinese are a very cruel people. There were public executions in the old city in Shanghai, which took place in little sort of what looked like little bull rigs. I often used to pass by.
And see them?
No, I never saw them. Of course not, because I was protected from that sort of thing. But they would always draw a thoughtful crowd. And I think the Chinese, for thousands of years, have been brought up to have very low expectations of life. And cruelty confirms their rather pessimistic view of existence.
Well, now, you did see, I know, as you travelled, we're going to open this slowly, as you travelled out of the camp, you saw a group of Japanese slowly torture and murder a Chinese coolie. Now,
yes.
This is your other object. And I wondered whether you had seen so much by the age of 15 that in choosing a skull, it doesn't have the eerie feel to it that it does for me, perhaps. Do you feel at ease with the human body and all its sort of vileness, decay?
Firstly, I don't think the human body is vile in any way. I think even the sort of cadavers that I dissected in the anatomy school at Cambridge preserve their dignity, very, very much so. I mean, I never felt dissecting a cadaver that I was in any sort of superior position. In fact, quite the opposite. I mean, these dissection room cadavers had been donated by doctors before their deaths, and there was something profoundly moving, a great tribute to the human spirit that, these men and women doctors, a few of them, had left their bodies to the next generation. And I had this skeleton, which I used to study anatomy, and I used to handle the skull almost every day and the other bones and examine it, and one couldn't help but sort of find the personality, or what seemed to be the elements of a personality, in the particularly in the skull, but of course also in all the other bones. And one, developed, I think I developed a tremendous respect for human beings, however damaged or however ill they were.
Do you find from the life you've led and what you've discovered that you have a spiritual dimension to human existence, or do you really see man as a mechanical creature?
I think man is a mechanical creature, though, with a sort of soul and mind of a poet, and I think the imagination is what our imaginations that allow us to transcend the universe. I mean, the universe may be in the largest sense, a cold and alienating place, but we at least have the gift of the imagination and the gift of the spirit, and that's something the universe doesn't have on its own. I think we have a clear advantage there. There was once, that skull was once, full of dreams, hopes, ambitions, an alternate universe to the one that lay around it, probably in the paddy fields of Southeast Asia. However harsh the life this human being led, inside that skull, dreams flew.
Now, Jim, these objects reflect a later period in your life, and this photograph here reflects the second catastrophe that destiny dealt you, because when you were married with 3 young children, happily married, or everything to look forward to, things going well, your wife died very suddenly. Now, how did you make sense of that event?
Well, it absolutely bowled me for 6. It took me a very, very long time to recover from it, if I ever have. I think I have, with the help of my children. And that photograph shows me about a year after my wife died with my three children. I think it was 1965. I've often, people have said to me, how did you manage to bring them up? And I've always said, well, they brought me up. And I think that was literally the case. They provided the sort of stability and the good sense and the confidence, and they're very buoyant. And they swept me along. And I wasn't able to look at the past, because they, of course, soon forgot the past. And it was the years that followed that photograph were very, very happy years. I mean, I think I had a second childhood, actually. I think I had a first childhood. I think the childhood I'd not experienced myself, thanks to the war, I was able to experience for the first time through my own children.
How did you cope?
I made a decision very early on that I couldn't provide anything that remotely resembled gracious living. And as that photograph shows, I mean, our life in our sort of semi-detached house in Shepperton, it was just like a huge untidy nest. And cleanliness was definitely not next to godliness. In some ways, it was a pretty ungodly place, but it was very, very happy. I think part of the problem I faced was that so few men in the mid-60s were looking after children on their own, and it was made pretty clear to me by sort of men and women, and even by the sort of local social services, that this was, who briefly put their nose around the door, that this was not the sort of thing a man should be trying to do. But I think any man doing so today would find it, wouldn't find that sort of social disapproval.
You were able to do this because you were at home as a writer, and you were writing science fiction, what you call apocalyptic fiction. Now, this is another of your objects. It isn't science fiction, but it's the height of surrealism, and a lot of the visions, the landscape visions of your novels are as surreal in this way, aren't they?
Yes, this is the original of this was painted by one of the great surrealists, Paul Delvaux, a Belgian painter, and it was painted in 1936 and destroyed during the Second World War in the Blitz, and it had been bought and brought to London. And in something like 1980, I think it was about 1987 or 88, I thought I wanted to I very much wanted to buy a Delvaux, but his prices there were astronomical. This painting cost several £100,000, and I thought, rather than bankrupt myself by buying an existing Delvaux, what I would do would be to commission another painter to bring to life one of these lost Delvaux, one of these Delvaux destroyed in the war. And this one was destroyed, the original of this one was destroyed in 1940, and it only survived as a black and white photograph, which I found in a collection of reproductions of Delvaux's work. So I approached an American artist, Bridget Marlin, whom I know, and asked her if she would accept a commission. And I think she's really a very sort of religious woman who was a very fine painter of religious topics, and I think she thoroughly disapproved of my choice, but she faithfully executed the painting, which now sits in my living room, and I've had it for about 5 years, and I think in many ways I've gone to live in that landscape.
Of all the most extraordinary objects, this has to take the biscuit. It is indeed what it looks to be, a crashed American car. Why?
Well, the crashed car, as everyone who has sort of read my fiction knows, has played a central part in it. I held an exhibition of crashed cars in 1969 as a sort of trial run for my novel, Crash, which I published in 1972, which I think is probably my most original and best book.
It's quite a horrendous book. It's about how crashing cars become evolved with the erotic life of the protagonist, who sees sex and the crashed car as converging and gets excited by crashes, by women with scars. Now, this is a deeply disturbing book. Were you very disturbed when you wrote it?
I think I was. I think in a way the novel is the record of a sort of mental crash that I had in the mid-60s after the death of my wife. And I think my interest in car crashes, and to some extent in media violence, and the late 60s were saturated with violent imagery. I think all that was an attempt to sort of make sense of to some extent my wife's death, but also of all those deaths that I'd seen in China during the Second World War, which my wife's death reminded me of. And I think, in a way, if I could I could turn logic upside down, if I could make black white and white black, if I could prove to myself that the car crash was not a giver of death, but a giver of life, that somewhere beyond the sort of collision of the human body and technology, between the human imagination and technology, there was a sort of a happier uplands. If I could do that, I could sort of, I don't know, in some sort of crazed way, sort of bring my wife's spirit at least back to life. And many people thought of it as pornographic, and to some extent, of course, Crash is a pornographic novel. The first pornographic novel based on technology, but then we lived in those days in pornographic times.
You had the exhibition in 1969, but the 60s were a very lively time for you. You were rather typical of the reputation it has. You took LSD, you were around and about in arty circles. Did you enjoy it, or did you have to just come through it?
I found it a tremendously exhilarating time. Of course, most hours of the day I was looking after young children, but in the evenings I would, dash off to London. Not every evening by any means, but and also I spent a great deal of time watching television, which was tremendously, I think it set the agenda of the 60s. And of course, it was a violent TV epoch. I mean, people who worry about violence on television now have forgotten what it was like then. I mean, we had the most graphic footage from the Congo, Biafra, and of course Vietnam. And I felt that a sort of culture of violence was being set up in which pure sensation was all that counted. And there was something very sinister about it. It was like sort of pumping an electric current through the leg of a dead frog. All that mattered was getting this dead muscle to kick. And the whole of our culture was rather like that. That, Crash, I think, and the exhibition and the book that followed, grew out of that culture of violence.
This is totally different in mood, and your final object.
Well, this is the vehicle that I would like to ride around in today. My girlfriend, Claire, whom I've known for 25 years, bought it for me as a real surprise for my 60th birthday. And I've always actually wanted to ride the unicycle. And I've been practicing ever since she gave it to me. And I think, in a way, it was a very shrewd judgment of my character by her that she should get me this machine, which it's a piece of poetry, of course. And that, I mean, needless to say, is a very low mileage model. I've gone about 3 feet in it so far. But I think it was an interesting judgment on my character.
What is she saying then? In buying you that, what comment is she making?
Well, I think she sees me as a sort of trick cyclist, perhaps. Somebody who's determined to sort of defy gravity and is capable of, I hope it's a complimentary sort, capable of staying upright in defiance of all the normal laws of time and space.
So does it sum you up? Are you a one-wheel vehicle?
I think I am, actually. I'm a one-wheel trick cyclist with a very low mileage.
J.G. Ballard, thank you.
Conflict and questions of identity. John Kelly presents Off the Walls from Northern Ireland, next on 4.